The great hall of the Zephyrian Council buzzed with the familiar mixture of disgust and curiosity that always accompanied the monthly cleansing ceremony. High Counselor Vextar stood at the center of the circular chamber, his forearms gesturing gracefully as he addressed the assembled crowd. His crystalline skin caught the light of the floating orbs overhead, casting rainbow patterns across the polished stone floor. "Citizens of Zephyr Prime," his voice resonated through the chamber with the musical quality typical of his species. "We gather once again to purge our society of the unworthy offspring that threaten our genetic purity." The crowd murmured approval. Around the edges of the great hall, various alien species nodded in agreement. The Zephyrians had built their empire on the foundation of beauty and genetic perfection. Every child born within their territory underwent strict evaluation within their first month of life. Those deemed beautiful enough to contribute to society were welcomed with celebration. The others faced a different fate. Vextar gestured toward a row of small containers near the chamber's edge. Each held an infant from one of the many species under Zephyrian rule. "Today, we have collected 17 specimens that fail to meet our standards. As is tradition, they shall be offered to Korath the Dragon Hunter as tribute for his continued protection of our realm." The mention of Korath sent a visible shiver through the crowd. Even the bravest Zephyrian soldiers spoke his name in whispers. For 300 years, the massive creature had served as their realm's ultimate guardian, dwelling in the volcanic mountains beyond the eastern border. No enemy had ever successfully invaded Zephyrian territory, while Korath remained in their service. The price for this protection was simple: regular offerings of food, precious metals, and whatever unwanted creatures the Zephyrians produced. Most beings assumed Korath simply devoured these offerings. The dragon hunter had never been seen to refuse anything delivered to his mountain lair. Whether he ate the creatures immediately or saved them for later consumption was a matter nobody cared to investigate too closely. "Let the purging begin," Vextar declared. One by one, the containers were brought forward. The crowd observed with detached interest as each infant was examined and its species announced: a malformed Trilaxian with too many tentacles, a Gordoran whose scales had grown in an irregular pattern, a Helix whose crystalline formations were cloudy rather than clear. Each received the same judgment: unworthy. When the guards reached the final container, even Vextar paused. Inside lay what appeared to be one of the strangest creatures any of them had ever encountered. It had only 4 limbs instead of the usual 6 or 8. Its skin was a disturbing pinkish color with no scales, crystals, or other proper defensive coverings. Most shocking of all, it had only 2 eyes, positioned directly in the front of its head rather than distributed around the skull for proper vision coverage. "What species is this?" Vextar asked, his melodious voice tinged with revulsion. The guard consulted his datapad. "Records indicate it is called a human, High Counselor. Origin planet, Earth. The birth parents were traders who died in a transport accident 3 weeks ago. The infant has been in temporary care at Medical Station 7. Vexatar leaned closer to examine the creature. The human infant looked up at him with those disturbing front-facing eyes and made a soft, cooing sound. "Absolutely hideous," he pronounced. "Look at that grotesque skin and those primitive limbs. I have seen cave slugs with more aesthetic appeal." The crowd laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Several citizens took images with their recording devices to share the amusing sight with friends who had missed the ceremony. "This specimen represents the absolute worst of genetic deviation," Vextar continued. "Let it serve as an example of how far from perfection some species have fallen. Package it with the others for immediate delivery to Korath." The guard nodded and sealed the container. The human infant seemed unbothered by the proceedings, occasionally reaching toward the lights overhead with tiny fingers. Within an hour, the entire collection of rejected infants had been loaded onto a transport vessel. The pilot, a young Zephyrian named Kelthos, tried not to look too closely at his cargo as he guided the ship toward the eastern mountains. This was his first time making a delivery to Korath, and the veteran pilots had filled his head with stories of the dragon hunter's terrifying appearance and violent temper. The volcanic peaks grew larger as Kelthos approached the designated landing zone. According to the ancient treaty, offerings were to be left at the entrance to Korath's cave system, and the delivery vessel was to depart immediately. No direct contact was permitted or desired. The landing zone was a flat area of black volcanic rock about halfway up the largest mountain. Kelthos set the transport down as gently as possible and quickly began unloading the containers. The air here was hot and smelled of sulfur. In the distance, he could hear the rumbling of active volcanic vents. As he placed the final container, the human infants, on the rocky ground, Kelthos heard a sound that made his crystalline skin lose all color. Heavy footsteps, each one causing small tremors in the ground, approached from deeper within the mountain. The dragon hunter was coming. Kelthos ran back to his transport as fast as his 4 legs could carry him. He initiated launch procedures while the engines were still warming up, desperate to be gone before Korath appeared. The transport lifted off just as a massive shadow fell across the landing zone. From his rapidly ascending viewpoint, Kelthos caught his first and last glimpse of the legendary dragon hunter. Korath stood nearly 20 feet tall, with dark scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His body was roughly humanoid, but impossibly broad and muscular. 2 massive wings folded against his back, and his elongated skull housed jaws filled with teeth the size of sword blades. Most striking were his eyes. Ancient, intelligent, and completely focused on the offerings that had been left for him. Kelthos pushed his engines to maximum power and fled toward home, already composing the brief report he would submit to the council. Delivery completed successfully. No complications. Korath appeared pleased with the offering. It was the same report every pilot submitted. None of them wanted to admit how thoroughly terrified they had been by their encounter with the dragon hunter. Back on the volcanic plateau, Korath approached the containers with careful steps. Despite his massive size, he moved with surprising grace, each footfall placed precisely to avoid disturbing the fragile cargo. This monthly ritual had become routine over the centuries, but he still treated each offering with the same careful attention. The first several containers held the expected variety of rejected infants. Korath examined each one briefly before setting them aside in a specific arrangement. To any observer, it would have appeared he was simply sorting his food by some criteria known only to him. The reality was far more complex. When Korath reached the final container, he paused. Inside was a creature unlike any he had received before. The infant was clearly from a species he had never encountered, with features so different from the normal Zephyrian subjects that it almost seemed to belong to an entirely separate category of life. The human baby looked up at him without fear. Most infants cried or showed signs of distress when first seeing Korath's imposing form. This one simply gazed at him with calm curiosity, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed more like attempts at communication than expressions of need or discomfort. Korath had lived for over 800 years. In that time, he had encountered countless species and learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a creature's potential. There was something about this strange pink infant that sparked his interest. The way it tracked his movements suggested unusual visual processing capabilities. Its calm demeanor indicated either remarkable emotional stability or an unusually high level of cognitive development for such a young creature. More importantly, Korath's enhanced senses detected something the Zephyrians had missed entirely. This infant carried genetic markers indicating tremendous adaptive potential. Its DNA contained sequences that suggested the ability to thrive in a wide variety of environments and circumstances. To the Zephyrians focused only on immediate aesthetic appeal, the human baby appeared worthless. To Korath, it represented something far more valuable: untapped possibility. The dragon hunter carefully lifted the human infant from its container. The baby made happy gurgling sounds and reached toward his massive scaled face with tiny fingers. When those fingers made contact with his snout, Korath felt a slight tingle of recognition. This creature possessed latent abilities that resonated with his own enhanced nature. For 3 centuries, Korath had maintained his agreement with the Zephyrians purely as a matter of convenience. Their offerings provided him with a steady supply of young creatures to study and, when possible, to save. The Zephyrians assumed he devoured everything they sent him, but the truth was far different. Deep within his mountain home, Korath had created a sanctuary where dozens of rejected beings had grown to adulthood under his protection and guidance. The dragon hunter had learned long ago that the Zephyrian concept of beauty had little correlation with actual worth or potential. Many of the creatures they considered defective possessed remarkable abilities, once given proper care and training. He had rescued brilliant scientists whose scales grew in unusual patterns, gifted artists whose crystalline formations were slightly irregular, and natural leaders whose physical features failed to meet arbitrary aesthetic standards. This human infant would be his greatest rescue yet. Korath could sense the tremendous potential sleeping within the small creature's developing mind. With proper guidance, this being could grow to surpass even Korath's own considerable abilities. Gathering all 17 containers, Korath began the journey deeper into his mountain home. The path wound through natural tunnels that gradually widened into vast caverns. The volcanic heat that made the outer slopes uncomfortable provided perfect climate control for the deeper chambers. Centuries of careful engineering had transformed the mountain's interior into a complex of living spaces, laboratories, and training facilities. As Korath entered the main residential cavern, dozens of beings looked up from their various activities. Former Zephyrian rejects now thrived in this hidden community. They had learned to set aside the self-doubt instilled by their original society and embrace their unique gifts. Under Korath's guidance, they had become engineers, artists, healers, and scholars, far surpassing anything the Zephyrian Empire had ever produced. "Another delivery?" asked Siantha, a Trilaxian whose excessive tentacles had made her unwanted by Zephyrian society. Those same tentacles now allowed her to perform delicate mechanical work that no other being could match. She had become Korath's chief engineer, maintaining the complex systems that kept their mountain sanctuary functioning. 17 this time, Korath replied, his voice a deep rumble that somehow conveyed warmth despite its intimidating timbre. "Most will integrate well with our existing community, but this one," he held up the human infant. "This one is special." The other residents gathered around to examine the latest arrival. Unlike their former Zephyrian masters, they had learned to look beyond surface appearances to recognize true potential. Several immediately noticed the human's unusual features and began speculating about possible capabilities. "Only 2 eyes, but positioned for exceptional depth perception," observed Mordek, a Gordoran whose irregular scale pattern had hidden his genius for mathematics and engineering. 4 limbs instead of 6, but the configuration suggests remarkable dexterity and flexibility, added Chixara, a helix whose cloudy crystals had concealed her gift for biological sciences. Korath nodded approvingly. His rescued community had learned to appreciate diversity rather than fear it. "This being represents a species called human. I have never encountered their kind before, but initial analysis suggests extraordinary adaptive potential. The human infant seemed to enjoy the attention, making pleasant sounds and reaching toward the various beings examining it. Unlike most newborns, who typically showed stress when handled by unfamiliar creatures, the human appeared completely comfortable with the diverse group surrounding it. "What do you plan to call it?" asked Vexana, a young Zephyrian who had been cast out for having asymmetrical skin patterns. She had become one of Korath's most dedicated students, learning to channel her natural empathic abilities into healing arts. Korath considered the question carefully. Names held power and meaning in his philosophy. This being would need a designation that honored both its origins and its tremendous potential. Marcus, he decided finally. An ancient name from human mythology, meaning warrior, but carrying connotations of protection and service. The newly named Marcus made a sound that might have been approval, or perhaps simply contentment at being held securely in Korath's massive hands. Either way, it marked the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would reshape not only Marcus's destiny, but the fate of the entire Zephyrian Empire. As night fell over the volcanic mountains, Korath settled into his private chambers with his newest charge. Marcus had fallen asleep during the introductions, displaying the remarkable adaptability that would come to define his species. Tomorrow would begin the careful process of nurturing this unique being's development. But tonight, Korath simply marveled at the unexpected gift the Zephyrians had unknowingly delivered. In their arrogance and shallow focus on physical beauty, they had discarded what might prove to be the most valuable being ever to enter their territory. Korath smiled, an expression that would have terrified any Zephyrian, but carried only gentle affection for the sleeping human infant. The Zephyrians had no idea what they had just given away. 5 years had passed since Marcus arrived at Korath's mountain sanctuary, and the human child had exceeded every expectation the dragon hunter had harbored about his species' potential. What had begun as careful observation of an interesting specimen had evolved into genuine amazement at human adaptability and ingenuity. Marcus stood in the main workshop, his small hands manipulating tools with a precision that left even Cyantha impressed. At 5 years old, he was already demonstrating mechanical aptitude that surpassed beings with decades of experience. The Trilaxian engineer watched as Marcus solved a complex calibration problem that had been troubling the sanctuary's environmental systems for weeks. "How did you know to reverse the polarity on the tertiary coupling?" Cyantha asked, her tentacles writhing with curiosity. "That solution required understanding interactions between 7 different subsystems." Marcus looked up with those distinctive human eyes, bright with intelligence and completely lacking the fear or deference that most young beings showed when questioned by adults. "I watched the patterns in the energy readings. When one thing changes, it makes other things change too, like dropping a stone in water." His explanation was simple, but it demonstrated something remarkable. Marcus had developed an intuitive understanding of complex systems by observing patterns and relationships that others missed. He could see connections between seemingly unrelated elements and predict how changes in one area would affect the whole. This pattern recognition ability had manifested early in his development. By age 2, Marcus was already creating detailed mental maps of the sanctuary's tunnel system after a single exploration. By 3, he was predicting equipment failures based on subtle changes in sound or vibration. Now at 5, he was actively contributing to problem-solving sessions that challenged beings with centuries of experience. "The human brain appears to excel at pattern synthesis," Korath observed from the workshop entrance. Despite his massive size, he moved so quietly that most beings never heard his approach. Marcus, however, always seemed to sense when the dragon hunter was near. "Korath!" Marcus abandoned his work and ran toward his guardian, showing the same fearless affection he had displayed as an infant. The dragon hunter carefully scooped him up in one massive, scaled hand. "Are you ready for today's lesson?" Korath asked. Marcus nodded eagerly. Their daily training sessions had become the highlight of his routine. Unlike the formal education protocols used by most species, Korath had developed a customized approach that leveraged Marcus's natural human curiosity and hands-on learning style. They made their way to what Korath called the Challenge Chamber, a vast cavern filled with obstacles, puzzles, and scenarios designed to test problem-solving abilities. Today's setup involved a complex maze with multiple levels and constantly shifting walls. The objective was simple: reach the center before the maze completed its reconfiguration cycle. Most beings approached such challenges through careful planning and systematic exploration. Marcus had developed a completely different strategy. As soon as Korath placed him at the maze entrance, the human child began running directly toward dead ends and apparently useless passages. To any observer, it would have appeared that Marcus was making random choices or simply rushing without thinking. Korath knew better. The human was using his remarkable pattern recognition abilities to map the maze's reconfiguration logic in real time. By deliberately encountering obstacles, Marcus was gathering information about how the walls moved and identifying the underlying algorithm that controlled their shifts. Within minutes, Marcus was navigating the maze as if he had built it himself. He reached passages just as they opened, avoided walls moments before they shifted to block his path, and arrived at the center chamber while the maze was still reconfiguring around him. "Impressive," Korath rumbled as he retrieved his student. "You completed that challenge faster than any being I have tested, including myself." Marcus grinned, displaying the resilient optimism that seemed to characterize his species. "It was like music, but with walls instead of sounds. Once I heard the pattern, I could dance with it." This metaphorical thinking was another distinctly human trait that fascinated Korath. Marcus regularly described complex concepts using comparisons that seemed completely unrelated, but somehow captured essential truths. His ability to find connections between disparate ideas often led to breakthrough insights that eluded more conventional thinkers. As they walked back toward the main living areas, Marcus peppered Korath with questions. This daily interrogation session was another human characteristic that never failed to amuse the dragon hunter. Most young beings asked simple questions about immediate needs or interests. Marcus's questions revealed a mind constantly seeking to understand the fundamental nature of everything around him. "Why do the Zephyrians think beautiful things are better than useful things?" Marcus asked. Korath considered his response carefully. Marcus had recently learned about his origins and the society that had rejected him. Rather than feeling hurt or angry, the human child seemed genuinely puzzled by Zephyrian values. "Beauty is easier to judge than worth," Korath explained. "Looking at something and deciding if it appears pleasing requires no effort or understanding. Recognizing true value requires wisdom, patience, and often deep investigation." "But that doesn't make sense," Marcus protested. "The most beautiful crystal formations in our caves are the ones that formed around useful mineral deposits. Beauty and usefulness work together." This ability to challenge conventional wisdom while offering alternative perspectives was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Marcus's developing intellect. He didn't simply accept explanations from authority figures. Instead, he evaluated every idea against his own observations and experiences, often identifying flaws or improvements that others had missed. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent chiming from the sanctuary's communication system. Siantha's voice echoed through the tunnels. "Korath, please report to the monitoring station. We have an unusual situation developing." When they reached the command center, a dozen rescued beings were gathered around the main display screen, their expressions ranging from worried to excited. The screen showed feeds from hidden sensors positioned around Zephyrian territory, part of the extensive surveillance network Korath had established to monitor his employer's activities. "Show him the transmission we intercepted," Mordek said, his mathematical mind already calculating probabilities and implications. The screen displayed a recorded message from the Zephyrian High Command to their military commanders. High Counselor Vextar appeared in his usual ceremonial robes, but his normally confident demeanor showed signs of strain. "Citizens of the Empire," Vextar began, "our exploratory forces have encountered a new threat beyond our eastern borders. A species calling itself the Carrick Dominion has begun aggressive expansion into territories we consider essential to our security. Initial contact attempts have failed, and their military capabilities appear to exceed our own." The message continued with technical details about Carrick technology and battle tactics. Marcus listened intently, his young mind absorbing and analyzing the information with the same focus he brought to engineering problems. "Early reports suggest the Carrick possess advanced energy weapons, adaptive shielding, and most concerning, the ability to rapidly adapt their strategies based on enemy responses. Our conventional military doctrine appears ineffective against their approach to warfare." When the message ended, the sanctuary's residents looked to Korath expectantly. For 3 centuries, he had served as the Zephyrians' ultimate guardian, but his contract specified protection against conventional threats. An invasion by an unknown species with superior technology fell into uncharted territory. "What are you thinking?" Vexiana asked, her empathic abilities detecting the complex emotions radiating from their leader. Korath's ancient eyes reflected centuries of careful consideration. "I am thinking that the Zephyrians are about to discover the difference between true strength and the illusion of power." Marcus tugged at Korath's scaled arm. "Can I see the battle recordings they mentioned?" Korath glanced down at his young charge with surprise. "You wish to study military tactics?" "I want to understand how the Carrick think," Marcus replied. "If they adapt strategies based on enemy responses, they're probably pattern-based learners like me. Maybe I can figure out their logic." The dragon hunter considered this request carefully. Marcus was only 5 years old, but his analytical abilities had consistently surprised everyone in the sanctuary. More importantly, his unique human perspective often revealed insights that escaped more experienced minds. "Very well," Korath decided. "But remember, we are studying this information to understand, not to participate in warfare." Over the following days, Marcus immersed himself in the available data about Carrick military operations. The human child studied battle recordings, tactical analyses, and intelligence reports with the same intensity he brought to engineering puzzles. His conclusions surprised everyone. "They're not adapting," Marcus announced during one of their evening discussions. "They're improvising." Korath raised a scaled eyebrow. "Explain the distinction." "Adaptation means changing your basic approach based on new information," Marcus said, using hand gestures to illustrate his points. "But the Carrick aren't changing their fundamental strategy. They're just getting better at applying the same basic principles to different situations." He pulled up a tactical display and began highlighting patterns in Carrick troop movements. "Look at this. Every battle follows the same underlying structure. Probe for weaknesses, concentrate force at vulnerable points, maintain flexibility for rapid repositioning. They win because they're really good at this approach, not because they're adapting to their enemies." Cyantha leaned forward with interest. "If they're not truly adaptive, that suggests they might be vulnerable to strategies that force them to change their basic approach rather than just apply it differently." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. The Zephyrians keep trying to outfight them using similar tactics. But what if someone used completely different rules?" This insight sparked intense discussions throughout the sanctuary community. Marcus's analysis had identified a potential weakness in what appeared to be an invincible enemy force. More importantly, it demonstrated how human pattern recognition abilities could provide strategic advantages that even experienced military minds had missed. As word of the Carrack threat spread throughout Zephyrian territory, panic began to take hold. Citizens who had always relied on their military superiority now faced the possibility of defeat and conquest. Emergency councils were convened, emergency taxes were levied, and emergency recruitment drives were initiated. None of these measures addressed the fundamental problem. The Zephyrians were facing an enemy whose capabilities exceeded their own. In desperation, High Counselor Vextar authorized something unprecedented in Zephyrian history. A direct communication was sent to Korath, requesting his personal involvement in the conflict. The message was delivered by Kelthos, the same pilot who had unknowingly delivered Marcus to the Dragon Hunter 5 years earlier. Kelthos landed at the same volcanic plateau where he had left his cargo years ago, but this time he had been instructed to wait for a response. When Korath emerged from his mountain home, the Zephyrian pilot nearly fainted. The Dragon Hunter's imposing presence seemed even more intimidating when encountered for the purpose of conversation rather than simple delivery. "The High Council requests your assistance," Kelthos managed to say, his voice trembling despite his attempts to appear professional. "The Carrack Dominion threatens our entire civilization. We invoke the ancient protection clauses of our treaty." Korath accepted the formal communication without immediate response. The treaty documents were complex, but the essential terms were clear. In exchange for regular tribute, Korath would defend Zephyrian territory against external threats. The Carrack invasion clearly qualified as such a threat. "Tell the High Council I will consider their request," Korath replied. "They will have my answer within 7 days." After Kelthos departed, Korath returned to the sanctuary to discuss the situation with his community. The Zephyrian's request put him in a difficult position. He had maintained his treaty obligations for centuries, but doing so now would require leaving his rescued beings vulnerable while he engaged in warfare against an unknown enemy. Marcus listened to these discussions with growing excitement. While the adults debated obligations and strategies, the human child was developing ideas of his own. When Korath asked for his thoughts, Marcus's response was typically unexpected. "What if we didn't fight the Carrack?" Marcus suggested. "What if we convinced them to fight each other instead?" The sanctuary fell silent as every being turned to stare at the 5-year-old human who had just proposed a strategy that none of their experienced minds had considered. Korath's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Explain your reasoning," the Dragon Hunter requested. Marcus began sketching diagrams on the workshop's display board, his small hands moving quickly to illustrate his concepts. "The Carrack are really good at fighting enemies who fight back using similar methods, but they've probably never encountered enemies who think completely differently about conflict." He drew 2 sets of military formations facing each other. "The Zephyrians keep trying to match Carrack's strength with Zephyrian strength, but humans have a saying, the best way to win a fight is to make sure it never happens." Korath leaned forward with growing fascination. "Continue. Instead of fighting the Carrack directly, what if we convinced them that their real enemy was someone else? What if we made them think their own allies were betraying them, or that a bigger threat was coming from another direction?" The human child's strategic thinking was unlike anything the sanctuary's residents had ever encountered. Rather than focusing on conventional military solutions, Marcus was proposing to solve the problem by changing the fundamental nature of the conflict itself. Cyantha's tentacles writhed with excitement as she grasped the implications. "Psychological warfare instead of direct confrontation. Make the enemy defeat themselves through confusion and misdirection." "But how would we implement such a strategy?" Mordek asked, his mathematical mind seeking concrete steps and probabilities. Marcus grinned with the confidence of a being who had never learned that some problems were supposed to be impossible to solve. We use what humans do best. We improvise. The plan that emerged from Marcus's unconventional thinking was unlike any military strategy in recorded galactic history. Rather than meeting the Karak Dominion with force, Korath and his sanctuary community would implement what Marcus called chaos theory warfare, using small, precisely targeted actions to create large-scale confusion and self-destruction within enemy ranks. Preparation took 2 weeks. During this time, Marcus worked alongside the sanctuary's most brilliant minds to refine his strategy. The human child's natural pattern recognition abilities, combined with his species' talent for improvisation, produced a complex web of deceptions and misdirections that would make the Karak question everything they thought they knew about their invasion. The first phase began with Siantha's engineering expertise. Using her exceptional tentacle dexterity, she crafted dozens of small reconnaissance drones designed to mimic Karak technology. These devices would infiltrate Karak communication networks and plant carefully fabricated evidence of betrayal and conspiracy within their command structure. Mordek contributed his mathematical genius to the project by calculating precise timing sequences for their interventions. The Gordaran had identified critical decision points in Karak battle planning, where small disruptions could cascade into major strategic confusion. Kixara's biological sciences expertise proved crucial for creating false evidence of a plague spreading through Karak ranks. Her cloudy crystals, once considered a defect by Zephyrian standards, actually enhanced her ability to synthesize complex biochemical compounds that would trigger Karak medical sensors without causing actual harm. Even Vexana's empathic abilities played a role. She helped Marcus understand the psychological profiles of individual Karak commanders, identifying which ones were most likely to respond to specific types of manipulation. As the diverse community worked together, Korath marveled at how Marcus had instinctively recognized and leveraged each being's unique capabilities. The human child hadn't simply created a plan, he had designed a strategy that transformed every perceived weakness in their group into a strategic advantage. "Are you certain this will work?" Korath asked as they made final preparations. Marcus looked up from where he was calibrating communication equipment with the casual confidence that characterized his species. "Nothing is certain, but humans have learned to be comfortable with uncertainty. We plan as much as we can, then adapt as we go." This philosophical approach to complex problems was perhaps the most distinctly human trait Marcus had displayed. Other species sought certainty and predictability, developing elaborate protocols to minimize unknown variables. Humans seemed to thrive in chaotic environments, using their adaptability and creativity to find opportunities where others saw only problems. The first phase of Marcus's strategy launched at dawn. Siantha's reconnaissance drones infiltrated Karak communication networks and began transmitting carefully crafted false intelligence. The messages suggested that several Karak commanders were secretly negotiating with an unknown third party for territorial concessions after the war. Simultaneously, Kixara's biological agents were deployed near Karak medical stations. Sensors detected the presence of exotic compounds that matched the profile of a rare plague known to affect their species. The medical alerts created immediate panic and demands for quarantine procedures. Marcus monitored the enemy response from the sanctuary's command center, his young mind tracking dozens of variables as the Karak military structure began showing signs of strain. "They're responding exactly as predicted," he reported. "Commanders are demanding explanations, medical teams are implementing emergency protocols, and trust levels are dropping throughout their hierarchy." The second phase activated 6 hours later. Mordek's precisely timed interventions began disrupting Carrick's supply lines at moments calculated to appear like sabotage by their own forces. Ammunition shipments arrived at wrong locations. Fuel deliveries were delayed by exactly the amount of time needed to miss critical refueling windows, and communication arrays experienced mysterious technical failures during important strategic discussions. By the end of the first day, Carrick military efficiency had dropped by 30%. Their previously coordinated invasion force was fragmenting into isolated units operating on incomplete information and growing suspicion of their own support structure. The third phase was perhaps the most audacious. Marcus had identified a crucial weakness in Carrick psychology. Their species placed enormous value on hierarchical authority and chain of command. Using this knowledge, the Sanctuary team began transmitting false orders that appeared to come from high-ranking Carrick officials. These orders were carefully designed to create conflicting directives that would force commanders to choose between competing priorities. Some units received instructions to advance, while others were told to retreat. Supply officers were given contradictory requests for resources. Intelligence operatives found themselves investigating their own commanders based on fabricated evidence. The beauty of this approach, Marcus explained to Korath as they watched the Carrick forces descend into chaos, is that we're not really lying to them. We're just arranging for them to lie to themselves. The human child's insight into the psychology of deception was remarkable. Rather than creating elaborate fictional scenarios, he had identified ways to make the Carrick misinterpret their own legitimate information. The confusion was emerging from their own decision-making processes, making it nearly impossible for them to identify the external source of their problems. By the third day, the Carrick invasion had effectively collapsed from within. Military units were fighting each other over resources and authority. Medical teams had quarantined half the invasion force based on false plague warnings. Communication systems had been shut down by security teams, convinced they were compromised by enemy infiltrators. From their mountain sanctuary, Marcus and his companions watched as the supposedly invincible Carrick Dominion retreated in complete disarray. Not a single shot had been fired by defending forces, yet the threat to Zephyrian territory had been completely eliminated. News of the mysterious Carrick retreat spread quickly throughout Zephyrian space. High Counselor Vex Tar called for an emergency celebration, claiming credit for a brilliant defensive strategy that had saved their civilization. The official story suggested that superior Zephyrian intelligence operations had confused and demoralized the enemy through sophisticated psychological warfare. Korath received a formal commendation from the Zephyrian High Council, along with a substantial bonus payment and renewed treaty obligations. The Dragon Hunter accepted these honors with his usual stoic demeanor, making no mention of the true architects of their victory. In the sanctuary, Marcus was less interested in celebrating their success than in analyzing what they had learned. The Carrick weren't really adapting, he observed. They were just applying the same rigid thinking patterns to every situation. When we changed the rules they were operating under, they couldn't adjust. This insight sparked a broader realization among the sanctuary's residents. The Zephyrians were exhibiting similar behavioral patterns. Their society was built on rigid aesthetic standards and hierarchical structures that discouraged creative thinking or innovative approaches to problems. Like the Carrick, they might be vulnerable to strategies that operated outside their conventional frameworks. "What are you thinking?" Korath asked, recognizing the expression Marcus wore when developing new ideas. "I'm thinking the Zephyrians rejected me because I don't fit their definition of beauty," Marcus replied, "but they also rejected everyone else here for the same kind of thinking. What if their whole society is built on throwing away their best people?" The implications of this observation were staggering. If Marcus was correct, the Zephyrian Empire had been systematically discarding its most valuable individuals for centuries, creating a society of conformity that lacked the diversity necessary for true strength and adaptability. Over the following months, Marcus began developing what he called the Sanctuary Protocol, a systematic approach to evaluating beings based on potential rather than appearance. Working with the other residents, he created assessment methods that could identify hidden talents, unconventional intelligence, and adaptive capabilities that traditional Zephyrian evaluation missed. The results were remarkable. When applied to historical records of rejected beings, Marcus's protocols identified patterns suggesting that the Zephyrians had discarded thousands of potentially brilliant individuals, engineers whose irregular features concealed innovative thinking, artists whose aesthetic nonconformity reflected revolutionary creativity, leaders whose physical imperfections masked exceptional empathy and wisdom. "We need to rescue more of them," Marcus declared during one of their evening planning sessions. "Every month, the Zephyrians throw away people who could change the galaxy. We could build something better than their empire if we saved enough of the right minds." Korath considered this proposal with growing excitement. For centuries, he had been rescuing individuals one small group at a time. Marcus was suggesting they scale up their operations to create an entirely new kind of society, one built on diversity, creativity, and adaptive potential rather than superficial conformity. Such an undertaking would be extremely dangerous, Korath warned. If the Zephyrians discovered our activities, they would view them as a threat to their entire social order. Marcus grinned with the fearless optimism that defined his species. "Then we'll have to be creative about how we do it. Humans are good at working around rules we don't like." The plan that emerged over the following weeks was vintage Marcus, audacious, unconventional, and built around turning perceived weaknesses into strategic advantages. Rather than directly confronting the Zephyrian system, they would subvert it from within, using the Empire's own processes and assumptions. Cyantha would create false documentation systems that made rejected beings appear to have died during transport to Korath's mountain, allowing them to be secretly relocated to new sanctuary facilities. Mordek would identify patterns in Zephyrian bureaucracy that could be exploited to redirect resources and cover their operations. Kixara would develop biological markers that could help identify beings with exceptional potential before they faced official evaluation. Most importantly, Marcus would serve as their primary strategist, using his pattern recognition abilities and human intuition to stay ahead of Zephyrian security forces and administrative oversight. "What will we call this new society?" Vexana asked as their plans took shape. Marcus thought for a moment, then smiled. "The Constellation Alliance, because the most beautiful thing about stars isn't their individual light. It's the patterns they make when they work together." Within 6 months, the first satellite sanctuaries were operational. Beings who would have been sacrificed to Korath began disappearing from transport ships and reappearing in hidden facilities throughout the outer territories. Each new arrival brought unique capabilities that strengthened the growing alliance. The Zephyrians remained oblivious to what was happening. Their surveillance systems detected no unusual activity. Their bureaucratic processes showed no irregularities, and their dragon hunter continued to accept his regular tributes without complaint. The beautiful symmetry of Marcus's strategy was that it used the Empire's own blind spots and assumptions to conceal operations that were systematically undermining their foundations. As Marcus approached his 6th birthday, the Constellation Alliance had grown to include over 3,000 individuals spread across dozens of hidden facilities. Former rejects had become innovative engineers, revolutionary artists, brilliant scientists, and visionary leaders. They had developed technologies that surpassed Zephyrian capabilities, created art that redefined beauty itself, and established communities that celebrated diversity rather than demanding conformity. Korath watched his young human charge with profound admiration as Marcus coordinated alliance operations from their original mountain sanctuary. In just 1 year, This remarkable being had transformed a small rescue operation into a galactic movement that was quietly reshaping the balance of power throughout the sector. "What do you see as our next major objective?" Korath asked during one of their evening strategy sessions. Marcus looked up from the holographic displays showing Alliance territories and smiled with an expression that somehow managed to be both innocent and profoundly wise. "I think it's time the galaxy learned what happens when you judge beings by their potential instead of their appearance." The Zephyrian Empire had no idea that their most dangerous enemy was a small human child they had once considered too ugly to live. They had cast him away as worthless refuse, never realizing they were giving their greatest treasure to the one being capable of recognizing its true value. In their mountain home, surrounded by thousands of other rejects who had discovered their own worth, Marcus began planning the next phase of human expansion into a galaxy that desperately needed to learn new definitions of beauty, strength, and worth. The beings who had been thrown away were about to teach the universe that sometimes the most valuable things come in the most unexpected packages. And in the deepest chambers of Korath's mountain, safely preserved in a place of honor, sat the small container that had once held a homely human infant, a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion can reshape the destiny of worlds.